When you look at a map of Europe today, it feels so permanent, right? All those neat borders and familiar countries. But what if I told you that just a couple hundred years ago, that map looked completely different? This is the story of how one single powerful idea, nationalism, blew up entire empires and literally built the world we live in now. I want you to try and imagine a world without countries, at least not the way we think of them. For centuries, that was Europe. It was this messy, overlapping patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, and sprawling empires. You weren't Italian or German, nope. You were the subject of a king, or a prince, or an emperor. Your loyalty wasn't to a people or a flag, it was to a person. So how on earth do we get from that world, a world of dynasties and subjects, to the one we have now, a world of nations, united by things like a shared culture, language, and history? Where did this revolutionary idea even come from? Okay, let's dive into our first section, a dream of new nations, because that's how this powerful idea started. It wasn't a political plan. It was a dream. And this right here, this is that dream visualized. Back in 1848, a French artist named Frédéric Soriot created these incredible prints showing his vision for the future. He imagined a world of democratic and social republics, all living together in peace. And the symbolism in this image is just, wow, it's off the charts. You see how each nation is totally distinct? They have their own flags, their own unique outfits, all celebrating their shared culture. They're all marching past a figure that looks a lot like the Statue of Liberty, who's holding the torch of enlightenment. And check out what's on the ground, the shattered, broken remains of crowns and royal symbols. I mean, this was an absolutely radical vision of a world ruled by its people. But that dream, well, it was a world away from the reality of the time. This map shows you what Europe actually looked like in the early 19th century. It was a continent dominated by these huge, multi-ethnic empires, like the Austrian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. And you had these fragmented regions, like Germany and Italy. There was no single Germany yet, just a whole bunch of independent little kingdoms and states. So, let's move on to Section 2, the revolutionary spark. How did this dream go from a painting to a political firestorm? Well, the story really gets going in France. The French Revolution in 1789 was an absolute game changer. It introduced these two incredibly powerful new ideas, la patrie, which means the fatherland, and le citoyen, the citizen. All of a sudden, the idea was that the country belonged to its people, not to the king. Power, sovereignty, it shifted from just one person, the monarch, to all the citizens. And that famous tricolor flag, that became the symbol of this brand new French nation. And this whole revolution gave birth to the goal that would define the entire next century, the creation of the nation-state. This was the ultimate prize, a place where a group of people with a shared identity, a common language, culture, and history, could actually govern themselves inside their own territory. This was the dream of nationalism made real. Which brings us to Section 3, an age of revolutions. Because once this idea was out there, it couldn't be put back in the box. It spread like absolute wildfire, sparking revolutions all across Europe. And this timeline just shows you how fast it all happened. In 1821, the Greeks kick off their fight for independence from the Ottoman Empire. Then in 1830, you get another revolution in France, which in turn inspires an uprising in Brussels that creates the brand new nation of Belgium. And by 1848, it's like a dam bursting. A wave of revolutions sweeps the entire continent, from Germany to Italy to the Austrian Empire. The idea of the nation was on the march, and it seemed unstoppable. So what you have to understand is that this created a massive clash between two totally different visions for Europe. On one side, you had the liberal nationalists. These were often the educated, middle-class folks, and they wanted things like constitutions, freedom of the press, and parliaments. But on the other side, you had the conservatives, the old guard of monarchs and aristocrats, and they fought tooth and nail to keep their power and preserve the old way of doing things. Now, because standing up to a king could get you killed, a lot of this revolutionary work had to go underground. You had figures like the Italian revolutionary Giuseppe Mazzini, who created secret societies. His group, Young Italy, had one mission: to unify Italy into a single republic. He truly believed that nations were the natural way to organize humanity, and that fighting for your nation was practically a sacred duty. And that takes us to Section 4, Forging Nations in Blood. Because the hard truth is, a lot of those early idealistic revolutions failed. The dream of nationalism was about to be forged in a much, much harsher reality. So this next phase brings up a fascinating question. What happens when the ideals of the revolutionaries are co-opted by the very states and armies they were fighting against? Is it possible to build a nation from the top down, with sheer force? For the answer to that, we have to look at Germany. After a liberal attempt to unify the country failed in 1848, the job fell to one of history's most brilliant pragmatists, Otto von Bismarck of Prussia. This guy was no dreamer. He was a master of what's called realpolitik, basically politics based on practical power, not on fuzzy ideals. He famously said the great questions of the day wouldn't be decided by speeches, but by iron and blood. And this map shows you his strategy in action. Bismarck, using Prussia's incredibly powerful army, launched 3 short, decisive wars. You can see how Prussia, that big blue area, just methodically expands. It absorbs some states, makes alliances with others, and piece by piece builds a unified Germany completely under its control. The whole thing came to a head in January 1871. In the famous Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, of all places, the Prussian king William I was proclaimed emperor of a new, unified German empire. So the dream of a German nation was finally real. But it wasn't built by liberal revolutionaries, it was built by a conservative monarchy and its army. All right, on to our final section, from unity to imperialism. Because once these powerful new nations were born, the whole idea of nationalism started to take a very dark turn. And you can almost see the dangerous logic playing out step by step. First, nationalism forges a strong, unified state. Great. But then, that state pours all its energy into building up its industry and its military to compete on the world stage. And what does that lead to? Inevitably, this intense, jealous rivalry with other nations over everything from colonies to trade to military power. So here's the crucial takeaway. By the end of the 19th century, that original, liberating ideal of nationalism had been twisted. It wasn't just about freeing your people anymore. It was about proving your nation was better, stronger, and more dominant than everyone else's. And this aggressive, competitive nationalism turned Europe into an armed camp, a powder keg just waiting for a spark. And that spark was going to be found in the Balkans. This whole region was this incredibly complex mix of different ethnic groups, all trying to break free from the crumbling Ottoman Empire. As groups like the Serbs and the Bulgarians carved out their own nations, their ambitions started clashing with each other. And to make everything a million times worse, all the big European powers, Russia, Austria-Hungary, were meddling in the region trying to expand their own influence. The Balkans basically became the most explosive place on the planet. And in 1914, that powder keg exploded. Nationalism, now combined with imperial rivalry and a web of military alliances, plunged Europe straight into the catastrophe of the First World War. That beautiful dream of Soyuz, of nations marching together in harmony, it had become an absolute nightmare of trench warfare and unimaginable death. Which brings us to a question that is just as relevant today as it was more than 100 years ago. Where is that line? When does love for your country, patriotism, cross over into a dangerous nationalism that threatens everyone else? The story of 19th century Europe shows us just how terrifyingly fine that line can be.